May. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Global Affairs Unfiltered with me, Jack Stockwell. The 20th day of May, this Tuesday morning. And to catch up on all the big events of yesterday, of which there were some very important ones, some hopeful, and some absolutely horrifying. And we'll get to that during the first hour. The second hour, I was asked if I would go into a little deeper into who was behind what. A lot of people want to blame what's going on in the world with the Israeli lobby in Washington. And as I have said on my K-Talk programs many times over the last 30 years, there are powers behind powers that are behind powers. And even the man behind the curtain, there's another woman behind the curtain, behind the man behind the curtain. And I want to get into a little bit of that because it goes back to something called the black nobility that was around even before the Rothschilds and was one of the guiding forces behind them. So I want to get into that during the second hour. I think from a historical point of view, you might find that interesting. Well, yesterday, President Trump and Putin had their 2-hour phone call. They each described it as being constructive and useful in support of their combined efforts trying to get this Ukraine crisis solved. Trump spoke with Zelensky before Trump's call with Putin, and then he spoke with Zelensky again after his phone call with Putin, and he also briefed several of the NATO nations after the phone call with Putin. So you can see who the central player is here. Now, Ukraine and Palestine are two places in the world now clearly on a countdown for some kind of resolution, one way or the other, either for rescue or reconstruction or for complete devastation and potentially for an all-out nuclear war. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who is the president of the Schiller Institute, just recently made the comment that we are at an exhaustion point on both of these crises, Ukraine and Gaza. And she said it's either catastrophe or a new paradigm. Because, she says, we are crashing against the wall of the end of civilization. Now, among some of the more important things right now is the newly issued open letter from Pope Leo, which is gathering signers from all around the world, because the Pope's inaugural Mass, Saturday, May 17th, here 2 days ago, the Vatican became a meeting ground for many of the world leaders this past weekend, including Vice President Vance and Secretary of State Rubio. Now, we know that Vance is Catholic. I assume Rubio is. I'm not sure, but I assume he is. Both of whom met with the Pope. Now, for the Russia-U.S. leadership call, I'm not absolutely certain where Trump was. Was Trump back in the White House? But Putin was in Sochi at a music school. And I think Trump was in the White House for the phone call. And they were each positive in their descriptions of the call. Trump wrote on his Truth Social site, "Just completed my 2-hour call with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. I believe it went very well. Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations toward a ceasefire and, more importantly, an end to the war, with end capitalized. The conditions for that will be negotiated between the two parties, as it can only be, because they know the details of a negotiation that nobody else would be aware of. The tone and spirit of the conversation were excellent." Then President Putin, speaking to his reporters after the phone conversation, described that conversation as substantial, frank, and useful, and he thanked Trump for his support for renewal of direct talks between Russia and the Ukraine, which had been broken off by Kyiv back in 2022. And he said that Trump expressed his support for a ceasefire, Putin said he responded, well, we too favor a peaceful settlement. He didn't say we too favor a ceasefire. Trump is pushing for a ceasefire. Putin is pushing for a peaceful settlement. He said, what's needed is to find the most effective pathway. This is Putin. We are prepared to work with the Ukrainians on memoranda regarding a future peace agreement, regarding principles, timetables, and inclusively a ceasefire at a certain point. So in contrast to these two measured remarks, or the remarks of these two, Zelensky, of course, fresh back from his comedy tour, issued last night this impetuous call for this grandiose international conference with participants ranging from the European Union to a host of nations at a venue and a time yet to be determined. However, Trump specified in his posted report on his call with Putin that Trump has briefed the leaders of France, Italy, Germany, Finland, and Ukraine, as well as the President of the European Commission, that negotiations between Russia and Ukraine are to begin immediately. Again, who's the central figure here? He said this: the Vatican, as represented by the Pope, has stated that it would be very interested in hosting the negotiations. Let the process begin. Now in Gaza, of course, the situation is beyond horror. Over the weekend, Operation Gideon's Chariot was unleashed by the IDF with sweeping ground operations in Gaza, as Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu had pledged to do as soon as President Trump departed from his visit in Southwest Asia. A few remaining hospitals, there's only a few left, were hit, including the Indonesian hospital in the north. More homes and families have been wiped out. Today, Israel conducted over 30 airstrikes in less than an hour on Khan Yunis, where they had told the Palestinians to gather. You've heard me talk about that before. This is not new news. Gather over here. And then, of course, once they gather over here, then that's what gets bombed. And at the same time, Netanyahu had made a mock gesture toward allowing food into Gaza after a total ban on entry of food and humanitarian aid since, I think it goes back to March, the beginning of March. And reports are today that 5 trucks carrying baby food made entry at Karam Abu Salem. 4 more trucks are said to be approved for tomorrow. Contrast this with the 500 trucks a day before the IDF's starvation policy as another pillar of their genocide against the Palestinians was enacted. 4 trucks yesterday, 4 trucks today, but before they decided to starve them out, they were getting 500 trucks a day. So the UN networks confirmed that they will distribute the aid, while at the same time they're crying out for full-scale aid. A group of 22 nations issued a joint statement today acknowledging indications of a limited restart of aid permitted by Israel, but calling for much more. Canada, France, and Britain, among the 22, issued their own tripartite statement, including backing for the June UN high-level international conference on Palestine. Who's pushing Trump to push Netanyahu to feed these poor people? So the wheels are turning to implement the U.S. IDF collaboration in a very shameful pretense of food in the Gaza. The concept is food concessionaires for a death camp is about what it amounts to. American food and security vendors are contracting with the private, newly established Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is registered out of Switzerland, headed by American Jack Wood. One U.S. contractor company is said to be Safe Reach Solutions, just started up in November by a CIA official. Their operations are to partially start up in Gaza by the end of the month. But backing is urgently needed for this Oasis plan, for the full-scale life-saving action for all the Palestinians. And so there is this Memorial Day weekend, 24-25, the International Schiller Institute Conference. It wouldn't be a bad idea for you to tune in for part of it. Just go to schillerinstitute.com and register. So President Trump posted the following on his Truth Social site following his call yesterday with Putin. His prior call with Zelensky, and then following his call with several European leaders identified in the post. And this is on his Truth Social post. Just completed my 2-hour call with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. I believe it went very well. Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations towards a ceasefire and, more importantly, an end to the war. The conditions for that will be negotiated between the two parties, as it can only be, because they know the details of a negotiation that nobody else would be aware of. The tone and spirit of the conversation were excellent. If it wasn't, I would say so now, rather than later. Russia wants to do large-scale trade with the United States when this catastrophic bloodbath is over, and I agree. There is tremendous opportunity for Russia to create massive amounts of jobs and wealth. Its potential is unlimited. Likewise, Ukraine can be a great beneficiary on trade in the process of rebuilding its country. Negotiations between Russia and Ukraine will begin immediately. I have so informed President Zelensky of Ukraine, Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, President Emmanuel Macron of France, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni of Italy, and Chancellor Friedrich Merz, probably Friedrich Merz, of Germany, and President Alexander Stubb of Finland during a call with me immediately after the call with President Putin. The Vatican, as represented by the Pope, has stated that it would begin is very interested in hosting the negotiations. Then President Putin in Sochi spoke to the press after the call, and in rather rough translation, he said the call was very informative and frank, and in my view, it was very useful. He thanked Trump for his support for the renewal of direct talks between Russia and Ukraine, which have been broken off by Kyiv since 2022. Trump, he said, stated his position in favor of a ceasefire. Putin responded, "We too favor a peaceful settlement." Putin said that the results from the meeting in Istanbul showed that in general we are on the right path. He said the discussion with President Trump was constructive and highly valued by me. The question is for the Ukrainian side to show a desire for peace and for making the necessary compromises. For us, the main question remains the root causes. And he didn't go into them. Ursula von der Leyen posted the call with Trump was good, saying, "I want to thank President Trump for his tireless efforts to bring a ceasefire to Ukraine. It's important that the U.S. stays engaged. We will continue to support Zelensky to achieve lasting peace in Ukraine." And again, you have the situation here where you've got to interpret what they mean by these words, because it's not necessarily what you think peace means. So presidential aide Yuri Yushakov told reporters that the two leaders talked about trading 9 Russians for 9 Americans in a prisoner swap as part of a discussion of improving bilateral relations. He further stated that the two leaders seemed to be open to meeting in person, adding that Trump told Putin he would call him at any time. He could call him at any time. Ushakov also asserted that Trump revealed that while the U.S. Senate was preparing potential sanctions against Russia, he personally would prefer deals and not restrictions. Apart from the Ukraine issue, Trump also said that he sees Moscow as one of Washington's most important economic and trade partners, adding that there were impressive prospects for the two after the war is settled, according to Yushakov. Well, that just should warm your little hearts. 20 minutes after the hour, something's playing at K-Talk. So I want to get into Israel's Operation Gideon's Chariot. Gideon's Chariot, which is now in full operation. Yesterday, Israel greatly expanded its ground operations throughout Gaza in what they're calling Operation Gideon's Chariot. Last night, The IDF spokesperson, Brigadier General Effie Defrin, said this: "We are entering a new stage in the fighting. During the operation, we will increase and expand our operational control in Gaza, while bisecting the Strip and moving the population for its safety in all areas where we operate. Unlike before," he says, "we are now focusing on the offensive effort in the Gaza Strip until the defeat of Hamas in the areas where we are operating." Now, I am broadcasting both on the stream on at YouTube, Global Affairs Unfiltered, also at K-Talk. Whoop, they've got something playing again. At K-Talk at AM 1640. And whenever I see coming across the recording here that something is playing at K-Talk, I will mute my voice, but I will continue with the stream. So this the spokesperson for the IDF says, "Hey, we're back in business, and unlike before, we are focusing on the offensive effort in the Gaza Strip." Well, what were they focusing on before? I mean, if it wasn't the offensive effort, what were they focusing on? He says, this is not a halt to the hostage deal. The IDF will allow flexibility for the political echelon to advance any hostage deal. We're still working on it." So the European hospital in Khan Yunis was put out of commission a week ago by Israeli airstrikes. See, the thing is, before Gideon's chariot is unleashed on the defenseless Palestinians, and all the tanks and all the military, or the airstrikes and everything moving in, what you want to do is take out their hospitals before you attack them. I guess that's battle strategy. I remember reading somewhere that back in World War I, the ambulances, and there were Americans who were involved, before the Americans were involved in the war, World War I, there were still Americans over there, and some of them were driving the ambulances. And the ambulances would have a big red cross on it. And one of the first things they learned to do when these ambulances would be donated by various charity groups in the United States, once they arrived in France, they would paint over the Red Cross because it became an immediate target. Well, that kind of battle theory obviously hasn't been wasted on the Palestinians, because the first thing that the IDF did was to bomb the Indonesian hospital. So it's out of commission, and the IDF has ordered all Gazans out of the area. And over the weekend, the Indonesian hospital, that was the European hospital that got bombed. Over the weekend, the Indonesian hospital in North Gaza had to end all their services because they were all being driven out by the IDF. So yesterday, being Monday, Israeli strikes killed more than 100 people. Over the last week, the IDF claims they have killed dozens of terrorists. And yesterday's toll brings the total of identified Gazans killed to over 400. And even were every person the IDF identifies as a terrorist actually was, that still means that Israel, by its reckoning, is killing women and children at an unholy rate. Israel, under Netanyahu's control, has finally submits to minimal food for Gaza. I briefly mentioned that a minute ago. I like some of the things that Jeffrey Sachs just recently said in a YouTube channel. May 12th, non-attached member of the European Parliament. I like this. He says, all problems in the world go back to the British. That's, that's probably what I'm going to be talking about during the second hour of today's program. He went on to, he said that's true in Pakistan, in India, in China, the Mideast, and in Cyprus. They are the most powerful empire for 200 years and left behind conflicts everywhere. You know the disaster in Palestine right now, the reason is that between 1915 and 1917, the British promised the same territory to three groups. First, the McMahon communication, the British promised it to the Arabs. You fight with us against the Turks, it's all yours. Then they negotiated the Sykes-Picot Treaty to say that the French, it's yours. And then the Balfour Declaration in 1917, they said, it's a Jewish homeland. So the British promised three times land that wasn't even theirs to give away. They've got a lot of nerve as far as I'm concerned. Even today, Starmer acting like an imperialist. He doesn't have anything to back it up, although he's got a few nuclear weapons that could destroy the world. But the rest is a bunch of imperial nostalgia, let's say the Grand Empire wannabes. In any event, they fit the mold. All British problems are tough ones. They really are cynical, so they tied everything up in knots. And now you have to disentangle all of this, but this is where the problem originates. I'm going to save a lot of that for the second hour because there's a few other things that I want to bring up to date or make relevant because of the talk between the two presidents and the fact that they may be getting the Pope involved. And the EU summit that's Albania with the 4 European leaders, British, French, German, and Polish. And then yesterday evening, they were all on the phone with Trump. Merz is one of the main persons. Rubio met with the Pope. So the line coming from the Europeans basically is that they are now working closely with Trump, and Trump's patience with Putin is at an end. That's what they're saying. And they expect Trump will soon recognize that Putin cannot be trusted and so forth, blah, blah, blah. Well, basically, that's the surroundings. They basically say that the European Union is preparing its 18th package of sanctions, including the confiscation of what is remaining of Russian assets to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Well, we have to see what's the actual discussion between Putin and Trump. More of it's to be released. The Vatican issued a release on the meeting between Vance and Pope, which lasted about 40 minutes. They say His Holiness met with the Honorable J.D. Vance and afterwards met Archbishop Peter Gallagher, who's Secretary for Relations with the States and International Relations. So it's quite clear the Vatican wants to play a role in this, and that's probably a good thing. Other than the tea leaves of Vaticanology and criminology, what is going on is that the push for an enormous militarization in Germany is, the more I read of this, it's just absolutely breathtaking. Merz has announced that he wants the German army to be the biggest army in all of Europe. The new German Foreign Minister, Vadeful, says for the regular defense budget to be more than tripled, to triple the defense budget from 62 billion euros to 225 billion euros. And the Vice Chancellor and Finance Minister of Germany, Klingbeil, calls for cutting all budgets other than the defense budget, which is just an unbelievable situation in Germany. Does this sound familiar? If you go back 100 years, does this sound familiar? So the Ukrainians, of course, are not sitting idly by. While they're definitely in the last days, maybe the last weeks, I think months is too much of an exaggeration for this war to continue, but that doesn't prevent them from setting up a mixture, a combination of neo-Nazi groups around the right sector, which is a neo-Nazi group, in coalition with Russian separatists, planning to establish paramilitary units to fight at the front and to trigger social unrest in Russia in order to destabilize the Russian nation, calling openly for the disintegration of Russia into multiple fragmented states. And they're going to hold a signing ceremony with the right sector in Kyiv. So there's this continuous demand by the Russians that Ukraine must be denazified as one of these conditions. And I'm sure that was part of the discussion between Trump and Putin, where Trump is pushing for a ceasefire, and Trump is saying, you get rid of those Nazi scum out of the Kyiv government, and then we got something to talk about. So the situation on the battleground is moving. There was the largest drone attack by Russia on Ukraine. There are many reports that Ukrainian young men are trying to escape the forced draft by saying they prefer losses of territory rather than continuously dying. That's the majority in any kind of disjointed poll that have been taken. The Ukrainians are saying, give them the damn territory. Stop this war. And there's reports of other things, how many people who are sick, who are being ripped off the street, put into the army, some of the dying in the preparation of that, which is probably going on, but actually very difficult to verify because it's a frontline report. Now, very worrisome, in line with the militarization of Europe, is the fact that Germany and Great Britain together decided on the development, here we go again, of a new long-range missile with a range of more than 2,000 kilometers that has been presented by the defense ministers of both countries. British Defense Minister John Healey, German Minister Boris Pistorius. Naturally, 2,000 to 5,000 kilometers is called a medium-range missile. But they're calling it a long-range missile, and obviously this goes way beyond the capabilities of the Taurus. And the Taurus that is mooted in some alternative media articles, that MERS may have already decided on the Taurus, it's just not made public yet. So what is circulating widely is this so-called Green Book by the Bundeswehr, which demands a change in mentality, and it's basically long descriptions and handbooks about how the civilian society of Germany has to be pulled into a militaristically thinking population. These books are saying that the healthcare system has to be made ready to deal with 1,000 injuries a day from warfare, that it has all the detailed guidelines on how every household should have emergency reserves of food, water, and electricity, first aid courses, civil training in the schools, more money for the Red Cross, and so forth. I mean, it's complete hysteria. Now, MERS has demanded that Europe is expecting this from us, he says, and we have to take the leadership role for the rest of Europe, and that we have a clear prioritization of the military, and that will be decisive in shaping for the life of our children and our grandchildren. So that is the kind of warmongering going on now and everywhere. And then it says in one of these Green Book things, no, I think it was actually the FAZ that was commenting on it, that the way that all the major cultural contributions always depended on the willingness to sacrifice among the population is going to be the cardinal resource of militarization. In other words, if you are a loyal German or a member of the German state, and you are not capable of rendering military service, we want an equal counterpart from you in the sense of donations, efforts, services, whatever else you have. We have to become stronger, so you need to match the military contribution to this combined effort. I mean, they're saying that. That's the tone. It's unbelievable what's going on in Germany right now. Then there's a major effort in a new category of studies of various universities, different countries, called Vertischnik. It's a German word, Vertischnik, that is supposedly to be basically that in the faculties there is a newly introduced branch of the theology of defense, which is supposed to include various things, sponsored by the main military firms like Schleswig-Holstein in Bavaria and so forth. And these military firms are now financing or trying to finance this new branch of militaristic thinking in the German population. You'd think they'd have their fill of war by now. And naturally, fortunately, there's resistance coming from the students who are demanding a campus without Vertischnik. And appeals are being circulated, signatures collected, mostly by the students and employees of the universities. So there is a wave growing to counter what the government wants. And there are new laws being made in Bavaria. I mean, it's already implemented. Others are preparing for it, which forbids exactly that by calling it basically a threat to national defense issues. In other words, they're trying to pass a law to stop these students from doing anything that might impede the militarization of Germany. And then from the other side, the trade unions are making suits in other directions, saying that in the Constitution of Germany there is the guarantee of freedom of research and teaching and freedom of conscience. However, that, of course, doesn't bother those in power and control any more than the basic Bill of Rights here in America would impede Congress from our own congressional efforts to impede and get in the way of free speech. So this is somewhat worrisome. I can't imagine all the other countries of Europe doing the same thing. And so MERS is saying these other countries here are waiting for us. They're demanding leadership from us. But given the German history and the history of Europe, I'd rather suspect that the opposite is true, and that a lot of these other countries that MERS is referring to, egging on, cheering on the coming German militarization as something they might be afraid of. I mean, if Germany should put the militarization boots and shoes on again. However, there is a breaking situation in Germany, as we have seen here in this country and elsewhere, that the so far existing 100% backing for Israel by Germany, they obviously feel that in light of the escalation of the genocide in Gaza, that they can't maintain that attitude much longer. Therefore, the main story of the week of Der Spiegel, the magazine devoted entirely on the German position in respect to Israel and in light of what's going on in Gaza, and the headline of the article is Israel's critique and its raison d'etre. Raison d'etre, I think is how you pronounce it, the reason to exist. And how the Gaza war is changing Germany's view on Israel. So there is a possibility somebody's waking up. Now, I don't know if it's not too late to row back a little bit and take care of some damage control. But the talk has up till now been almost, not 100%, but better than 90% absolute war hawk, total anti-Russian talk. Just anti-Russian mania. But what they're saying now, what is coming out in the German press and some of their people openly speaking now, is that what Israel is now doing in Gaza is an offense to international law And there are those in Germany referring to this as ethnic cleansing. This is a complete violation of international law. And I'm only mentioning this because obviously this situation with the final solution being escalated in Gaza right now with Gideon's chariot, I mean, the final solution is kind of defined by the 1940s in Germany. The UN just came out with a report called Anatomy of a Genocide, which is being circulated in Germany. Now, on other items, von der Leyen, the president of the European Union, is now trying to undo or ruin Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines for good. She basically wants to dismantle them. I mean, this is incredible. In light of what's going on economically in Germany, you want to get rid of the last supply of cheap energy? And just to give you a flavor, there are so far some unconfirmed but nevertheless existing reports that the so-called corrective, this very ominous group of journalists that were behind the whole Potsdam scandal, which led to the pro-Ukrainian demonstration to quash the farmers' demonstrations last year in Germany. They have now put out that the EU is planning sanctions against Alina Lipp and Thomas Roper, 2 Germans living in Russia who have various kinds of journalistic activities, and this would be the first time that German citizens are now being sanctioned. And which means they cannot travel into the European Union. It means that all their possessions could be or will be confiscated, including no cooperation with them. So they could not even take legal advice because they're not going to be able to pay for it because their money's been confiscated. And even the lawyers may be put under punishment if they represent anybody that's saying something against the government. Does this sound like 1930s Germany? And then obviously, the situation in Gaza is just absolutely unbelievable. The latest, and I saw some pictures, some things on X, where they interviewed a desperate man who's saying, where should I go? I can't go north, I can't go west, I can't go south. And now yesterday, in this area of Khan Yunis, people were told to leave Khan Yunis because it's going to be bombed because there is a bunker below the hospital. And naturally, the latest reports are that and just think about for a minute, do you think Hamas is stupid enough to put a bunker under a hospital when they know the Israelis are going to bomb the hospital, not so much because they suspect the enemy has an encampment underneath the hospital, but because they're practicing genocide. They want to stop medical care and medical emergencies for the people they're trying to destroy. But they use the excuse, well, there's a bunker underneath that hospital. To me, that makes as much sense as bank robbers hiding out inside the bank vault once they stole the money. And naturally, the latest reports are that 500,000 of these people, mostly women and children, are in acute condition of starvation, which, according to the UN scale, is on level 5, the highest level. 2 million people are there, 500,000 of them on level 5 starvation. And this new aid organization, the U.S. organization, is just distributing humanitarian supplies at 4 distribution points. And there were pictures everywhere in the news showing hundreds of people holding up their pot. I saw this myself. It just tears at your heart. Holding up these pots, screaming desperately for food. And obviously there's hunger riots around these 4 spots the Americans are delivering aid. There were 400 distribution spots before. If you reduce that down to 4, and apparently there was some last-minute intervention yesterday where the U.S. insisted that the distribution take place, but it's very far from anywhere being adequate. So that kind of remains an explosive situation. I think that the two places, Ukraine and Gaza, are clearly on the ground toward a resolution one way or the other. And both of these processes are being exhausted. The Ukraine situation, because of the battleground situation where the Ukraine clearly has lost, where Ukraine has clearly lost, and any effort to prop them up through the Taurus missile or whatnot is not going to be a game changer, simply because the people aren't there anymore. See, this is how the Russians, the Soviets, won World War II against the Nazis. Because even though the Nazi army was better trained, better military tactics, better armament, better artillery than the Soviet forces absolutely outnumbered them. And I wanted to get into that in a matter of history, but there's just no time today. I was reading it was a memorial, not memorial. It was just a history written by Hitler's pilot. Hitler had one pilot that flew him around, and this fellow was flying him around in the 1920s, even about the time of the Munich Putsch. And from that point on, this fellow was the only person that Hitler would trust to fly him. And so this fellow stayed with the airplane, didn't leave it, and whatever new plane that Hitler would be in, this man would take it apart and put it back together again before he'd let Hitler near it. Well, he wrote some memorials, and he talked about how with even before Barbarossa began, it was doomed for failure simply because, well, not before it began, but shortly after, because they failed to take Moscow. And even though wave after wave of the Wehrmacht kept coming up against the Russians outnumbered them over and over again. So the Russians would send in 1 million men. 1 million men, and there was another 1 million lined up behind them, and another 1 million lined up behind them, which is how they finally won Stalingrad. And then from Stalingrad, of course, everything began to collapse. But still, the German army's attempts to take Russia failed after the failure to take Moscow. It was just a matter of steps that followed it. Now you got the situation in the Ukraine, where Ukraine would send in a division and another division behind them and another division behind them. And the Russians, because they have so many more, the Russians have control of the sky. There is no Ukrainian Air Force. All the hoopla and stuff that was going on about the F-16s, you hear anything about that anymore? No. And so the Ukrainian thing has to end up one way or the other because there's no Ukrainian men left to fight, except the sick and the elderly. And so the Germans saying, well, we're going to give them the Taurus missile. And now the Germans and the Brits are trying to come up with this medium-range missile that can go 2,000 kilometers. Yeah. Anything, almost anything they put up in the air, the Russians are shooting down with their sophisticated S-500 systems. Anything get through? Yeah, occasionally. You hear about a drone hitting an apartment building in lower Moscow. I mean, this what is going on there and what is going on in Gaza, both of them coming to a point of exhaustion because people are either being starved to death or they're being driven out with no place to go. And this is just an unbelievable cultural crisis for you and me as much as it is for them and for all of humanity. And it just underlines the absolute need to go in a completely different direction. And when you reach an exhaustion point, at least in historical processes, you either end up with an absolute catastrophe or you move into a new paradigm, as happened with the Peace of Westphalia. And this is why a new security and developmental architecture has to be really seriously discussed. Otherwise, we are like Thelma and Louise, flying past the last border of the end of human civilization. Now, I invite you once again. I do not represent Schiller Institute, although I am a member, a paying member. That it's only a few days away, less than a week away. The absolute focus of their activity is trying to do something about this absolute, complete war hawk discussions going throughout Europe, this total anti-Russian mania, and that more Germans are waking up to the fact that what Israel is doing in Gaza is against international law. Finally. Now, as I said, von der Leyen is trying to ruin or completely shut down what's left of Nord Stream 1 or 2. She basically wants to dismantle them. It's to a, you finally get to a point where you either throw your hands in the air and run off screaming, or you have to come to an understanding of the existential crisis in which you are facing. And so I probably should have mentioned earlier two terms which are two things that are really critical. One is that there's this unprecedented level of discussion about the role of the British in different media and different groups. Naturally, various Russians, Lavrov, Medvedev, Zakharova, are pointing to instigating the role of the British in a recent period very strongly. There's a video, actually a video short covering excerpts of Jeffrey Sachs' speech that I mentioned, that's already going viral, as it should. And you look at any conflict in the world, everywhere in history, it's the British. You know what? I think I'm going to talk about that during the next hour. I mean, if you look at India, you look at China, you look at Africa, and then all of these maps of the respective colonialist interventions by the British, and you begin to understand this ridiculous situation in which we find ourselves today. Then the second thing I wanted to mention during this first hour, of highest importance, is this fight that Tulsi Gabbard has started against Comey, accusing Comey of somehow being involved in an ongoing campaign of assassination of President Trump. And Trump himself reiterated the fact that he thinks Comey is involved in it. I mean, this is unbelievable. you have the U.S. Attorney General pointing a finger, no, not finger, yelling at a previous director of the FBI, accusing him of being in an assassination plot of the current sitting president. I mean, this tells you an awful lot about our current state of democracy and the rules-based order. I mean, if a head of state accuses the former head of internal security of being involved in an assassination plot, I think that alone is extremely telling of where we are as in terms of the Western system of life. But naturally, it's very real. And uh, uh, Tulsi Gabbard, Pam Bondi, both have expressed extreme concern of danger for President Trump. And anybody who is relevant in this fight, there's a high alert as a result of this entire configuration that's going on. So this isn't a time to, sit back and anticipate your coming summer vacation. This is really getting serious. And I think if you could spend a few minutes listening to some of the conference this weekend, I mean, history is clearly coming to a breaking point. And we have to make sure that what comes after these breaking points is something of a new paradigm, to which I can not only add 110, but 120%. That things are going to yet turn out for the better. And I honestly believe in my heart of hearts that is completely possible. So we're going to go to break here with the top of the hour. I want to make a couple of comments about America wanting to get food into Gaza. And then as soon as I'm through with that, I'm going to start British history. And after the news break at K-Talk, they can catch up to us. But Israel has couched. Okay, the radio station's on break. Not break, the radio station's going to news. So I will continue with us. The UN RWA that Netanyahu shut, United Nations Relief Workers Association, I think is what that is. The only lifeline for the last 17 months for 2 million people in Gaza, as necessary to prevent Hamas from stealing the deliveries. Sometimes they've also admitted that they've used starvation to pressure Hamas to accept Israel's terms, yet the whole world knows that the objective is to ethnically cleanse Gaza of Palestinians and to seize the land as a part of Eretz Israel. I saw a map. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. Where did I see that? A map of Eretz Israel and how they view the Middle East even beyond the borders of the new expanded greater Israel, into southern Europe, over into the Far East, down into Africa, the realigning of borders. It's not just that Israel would increase in its size to biblical proportions, but that other nations' borders would change, especially those that surrounded Eretz Israel. And it's just really amazing. So while Washington has continued to supply the bombs, concern has arisen over the optics of babies starving. So they have pressured Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to accept a U.S.-created alternative and delivery system entitled the Gaza Humanitarian Fund. Now, the only way that can happen, as members of this fund have come together, is that they have to have a private military to protect the food from confiscation by the IDF. And so Israel has experienced scandals in the past when documents have been uncovered showing calculations for the daily caloric levels in Gaza compared to those for the Nazi concentration camps. And the IDF recently told Hebrew media that each representative of a Gaza family will receive exactly the amount that is sufficient for his family to prevent a situation of starvation. I'm not making this up. These are Israeli documents that have been uncovered. There will be a representative for each family, and we know based on who's in that family, because maybe they've got the new smart license. I'm just kidding. We know that based on who's in that family, we know what the caloric levels are required to prevent starvation. Do you know what that means? Just that. We give them enough food to prevent starvation, but not enough food for them to get up on their feet and take care of themselves. Now, the New Arab has published a book which has a heavy reliance upon the use of private contractors to provide security for food arrival. It says this: on-site and perimeter security will be provided by experienced professionals, including personnel who previously secured the Netzarim corridor during a recent ceasefire. Two companies are identified as most likely at the center of the operation: Safe Reach Solutions and UG Solutions. They are to secure checkpoints and inspect vehicles heading into northern Gaza to tandem with Israeli forces. I wonder what is really going on behind the scenes here. That they need to have an armed military group watching food stocks. Now, the American security contractor took over the management of these checkpoints last January when a ceasefire was agreed to, including the IDF leaving the sites. So UG Solutions was identified as the security contractor. And then UGS and SRS jointly contracted over 100 former U.S. military personnel with plans to stock them with weapons such as assault rifles. UG Solutions was founded by Jameson Gavoni, a retired U.S. Special Forces soldier. He explained to ABC News that he had helped to create a Special Forces surveillance program aimed at training special operations soldiers to carry out surveillance and find hard-to-find terrorist cells. So this week, the New Arab is reporting that the UG Solutions website has posted job openings for coordination officers and humanitarian liaison officers in the Middle East. They have to have at least 7 years' experience working with humanitarian organizations, be fluent in spoken and written Arabic, and have extensive field experience in the Middle East, strongly suggesting they're pulling such staff from the soon-to-be bypassed UN and related organizations as a private army is being pulled together to be put into the Gaza under the flag of making sure that the basic quantity of food into Gaza is wholly adequate, when in fact it's wholly inadequate. And to have an armed force of former mercenaries, former military, be there to safeguard it. Now I'm looking for, I've searched, now that was released through the UNRWA, but I've been looking for other, mainly the New Arab publication, to find what the Israeli response to this is, and I can't find any. So when you have a paramilitary group, their website is posting job openings for coordination officers and liaison officers, and they aren't even there yet. I mean, they That's the stunning thing about this. All right, it looks like we're back up at K-Talk, AM 1640 for the second hour this May 20th. I'm just talking here about creating a private army to make sure that food is delivered to the starving Gazans. Just amazing. All right, now, I said I would get into the second hour. Hopefully I've got enough time to do this. With a bunch of notes. I've got notes from several different sources all of it should go into a book somewhere. And there's probably books on this subject. I know Richard Cook put together, even though I don't agree with some of Richard Cook's assessments of American history regarding British involvement, I agree with an awful lot of what he has to say. But this world crisis that I talk about every Monday and Tuesday, the crisis didn't just happen. Didn't just happen March 7th of 2023. It didn't just happen in February of 2022 in the Ukraine. This is something that's been going on for over 500 years. When this small island nation of England renounced Catholicism over Henry VIII's marital woes and embarked under his daughter through Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth I, in this occult program of world conquest. And the goal was to be accomplished through worldwide mercantile colonization, which of course would include very heavy trafficking in international slave and drug trades, and a war against a succession of leading European continental powers such as Spain and France and Holland and Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, the Russians. I mean, a rival that could not be immediately suppressed by the United States, which at that time had declared its independence in 1776. So recapture of the United States was also a priority among all these other countries of the British Empire's dominance. And the nation that most resisted the British more than any other nation was France. England attacked France by ruining its currency via credit bubbles, leading directly to the collapse and the destruction of French society through the 7 Years' War, and then the following economic collapse followed by the French Revolution. And then the looting of India, the looting of China helped fuel the growth of England's empire, feeding generations of estate building by the gentry on the English countryside. By 1694, when the privately owned Bank of England was founded. Oh, and one other thing about France I wanted to mention. To this day, do you know there are no U.S. bases in France? There are no military bases in France. De Gaulle kicked them out, and they've been out ever since. They're everywhere else. They're in Spain, they're in Germany, they're in Italy, they're in England. Portugal may even have them, I don't know, but just an interesting aside, France doesn't have any U.S. bases. But anyway, in 1694, when the Bank of England was founded, what soon became Great Britain had been taken over by international financial predators, practicing the system of fractional reserve banking that utilized compound interest to generate unending undeserved profits, of course. And this was just the grandest of grand larceny. accomplished by creating paper money out of thin air with a small amount of gold as backing. So the Jewish bankers became prominent in operating this system, which first appeared as a force in the Empire of Venice. The Rothschild family out of Germany gradually became the system's most visible controlling force through Western Europe. The Rothschilds of London set the price of gold well into the 20th century. And starting around 1835, the Rothschilds began to infiltrate the U.S. under their agent, August Belmont, with the Morgans and the Rockefellers setting up the infamous money trust as U.S. partners. And then the Rothschild headquarters, which is the square mile city of London there on the Thames next to the Tower. And as that was established and set up, the Bank of England, the British royals are their sponsors and their puppets. King Charles and Queen Camilla are puppets of this bank, as well as benefactors, enjoying incredible wealth in this ongoing payoff as these banking systems continue to try to have some veneer of legitimacy. And so they pay people off all the time. Where do they get the money to pay them off? Out of thin air, as fractional banking works, as far as that's concerned. But it takes the attention off of them and throws it onto the royalty. Now, the British have been able to use bankers' money to bribe European statesmen into joining this, at that time in the early 1800s, the British-led coalition to destroy Napoleon. Why was Napoleon such a threat to the European organizations, and especially Britain? Because he was trying to free Europe from the bankers by influencing Russian Tsar Alexander I after the Brits had assassinated his president, or his predecessor, Paul I. Britain was able to goad Napoleon into invading Russia. A mistake, obviously, that led to his downfall and to Britain's being able to mold and fashion its modern empire during the rest of the 19th century. Then meanwhile, back here in America, our first Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton, following the will and the desire of Washington to create a system of national government debt, actually worked. By the end of Washington's second term, the entire Revolutionary War debt had been paid off. And the American banking system would only loan money to business concerns that were doing something to improve the productive capability of the new fledgling American nation. There was no bond plays, no stock plays, no casino-type gambling stuff that the Bank of England was doing in order to get control of foreign nations. The result today of this devastating level of U.S. sovereign debt of over $36 trillion is because of the sellout to the British banking system, which debt can never be liquidated. Only, all they can afford to pay are payments on the interest. And as this debt continues to grow, it's going to crush populations with inflation, and it just makes every nation, to some degree or another, just a predatory insect against their neighboring nations. So you see all the stuff that's going on in the Balkans coming back to face us, the stuff between Pakistan and India, the stuff between the nations in sub-Saharan Africa, under banker control. Now, back to history here a little bit. Britain tried but failed to destroy the United States through the American Civil War. That was almost entirely a British operation. The South knew they couldn't win the war against the North because of the power of the Northern industrialization. South had to rely upon England financially and militarily because the South wasn't a militaristic, thriving productivity industry. It was agronomy. I mean, it was agriculture. And so the Brits knew after the War of 1812, they couldn't take the U.S. militarily. So they tried doing it financially. And through Jackson, it worked a little bit. But then Lincoln gets in there, and he saved the Union by issuing the interest-free greenbacks. And after buying up American assets for pennies on the dollar in the Panic of 1837, which spread even to Kirtland, Ohio, and the Mormons, Rothschild agent August Belmont had risen to become the chairman of the Democratic Party in the United States, which ran George McClellan against Lincoln in the election of 1864 with the aim of ending the Civil War in the South's favor. Because they figured if the South could win, so the South knew they couldn't win, but they thought they could be a thorn in the side of the North long enough that the North would finally let them go. And then the plan of General McClellan running against Lincoln in 1864, just prior to his death, of course, would end up with peace terms between the North and the South, not necessarily surrender, but would eventually allow further empowerment of the British Empire in the Southern government. Now, Britain supplied the South with weapons. The Times of London editorialized that the U.S. government had to be destroyed due to its policy. Its terrible policy of creating an indigenous U.S. currency, not British money. So the money trust to take over the U.S. industry, leading to the Rothschilds' seizure of the United States through the Federal Reserve insurrection of 1913. Thus, the British and its bankers were then able to monetize the U.S. industrial might in order to activate the processes of annihilating Germany. This was Britain's main 20th century geopolitical project, which still continues as a major imperial enterprise today, and the Brits are doing a wonderful job of destroying Germany, or having destroyed Germany, which is a step towards England, towards Russia. This is just all intertwined from one generation to the next. The eventual decimation and breaking up of Russia into various territories based on ethnic groups, based on different languages, so that the Brits can then go in and foment rebellion and have these people kill each other off so that what's left can easily be mopped up. Now, leading the British takeover in the United States was President Theodore Roosevelt, who had two uncles who served in the Confederate Navy and who gained power when British operatives assassinated President William McKinley in 1900. Why did the British operatives assassinate President McKinley? And this is something that gave me a little bit of hope. When Trump, last year during his campaigning, would occasionally mention William McKinley. William McKinley in 1900, prior to his assassination, clearly recognized the Bank of England and the Brits as America's greatest enemy. And by that time, even though after Lincoln's death, Johnson was pretty well able to steer American finance back towards British banking system. By the time McKinley ran for office, he ran for office on the understanding, or at least the promises, of throwing the Brits back out of the American financial system and reestablishing the American dollar that Lincoln had done. Well, the British operatives kill him. Now, at this time, Nathaniel Rothschild had set up a secret society called the Round Table in order to channel South African gold and diamond wealth of the late Cecil Rhodes to fulfill Rhodes' mandate to recover America for the British Empire. And one of Roosevelt's assignments was to run for president on the Bull Moose ticket against incumbent William Howard Taft in 1912. Now that split the Republican vote, which allowed the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, who was blackmailed by his handler and banker's agent, Colonel Edward House. If you've studied any of this stuff, you know who that is, you know that name, Colonel Edward House, to saunter into the White House and rubber stamp the Federal Reserve Act. That's why they, when you look back over this, it just begins to be so obvious. You can't understand history if you don't understand the source and flow of credit and cash, and who is in control of the credit. And because McKinley was trying to throw the British effort back out of the American banking system, it caught on. People understood their enemy. Their enemy wasn't, you know, the Spanish in the South and Mexico and Cuba and all the Teddy Roosevelt rah stuff. The enemy was the Bank of England, just as much as the enemy of England was the bank, and to this day, the Bank of England, England's greatest enemy. Because these people have no loyalty to borders, to countries. They have no loyalty to a lot of their own family. They have loyalty only to this trust. And so this trust did what it could to split the Republican vote by running Roosevelt against Taft to get their man, Woodrow Wilson, who had been blackmailed by his handler, Colonel, I don't even know if he was a colonel, Edward House. And the whole reason they got Wilson in there was to get Edward House into political circles to make sure the Federal Reserve Act passed in 1913. And ever since then, the Bank of England has been back in charge of American credit and interest and everything else. And so the British Round Table was mirrored by the Pilgrim Society, which married U.S. and British aristocrats into a common power base, which created Chatham House. And you've heard me talk about Chatham House many times. It's the CIA of the CIA. It's what's in charge of MI6, the CIA of Great Britain. And it became the permanent lobbying institution for endless imperial wars for the last 150 years. And it was matched by the U.S. Morgan Rockefeller-funded Council on Foreign Relations. And you know about that. And the Council on Foreign Relations continues to advocate for global imperial dominance to this day. And its publications now is the Foreign Affairs magazine. And I often quote from Foreign Affairs. when I'm trying to make clear and get across the power of this cabal. And so simultaneously, a different type of revolution was brewing among Europe's Jews, who were heavily influenced by Marxism. And they used Rothschild money to form the Zionist movement that began to infiltrate the Anglo-American governments with the aim of creating an apartheid Jewish state in Palestine that you see today. And an underlying cause of World War I, the annihilation of Germany, which was to set up and lead into World War II, which was designed to create, the outcome of that was designed to create the Israeli state and to create then thereafter a further slide into World War III and to create the greater Israel, Eretz Israel, that I was talking about in the last hour, as a world-dominating force. And this is part of what lies behind the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, the Great Reset. Now, I'm aware of some influence out there that claims that the one origin of the Zionist revolution can be traced through the Spanish Inquisition, stating that today's world revolution is not entirely Jewish at all, and cites Victor Hugo as a source of information via his play Torquemada, and that the CIA facilitated 20th century Operation Condor in Latin America as a related movement, which was a large-scale fascist movement to create all kinds of military-based intelligence terror from the mid-70s to the mid-80s, and the U.S. government used the Reagan administration to cover up and to run the characteristics of Operation Condor in something now known as the deep state. And so the takeover and twisting of Christianity by Christian evangelical Zionists using the Jewish finance Scofield Bible has also played a critical role. Also critical was the funding of Zionism by the elite among the 3 to 4 million Jews who had emigrated to the U.S. from Eastern Europe and Russia and had begun the takeover of Hollywood and U.S. media and finance and organized crime, and now eventually our government. As I was talking about yesterday, Thomas Massey's office is reportedly the only congressional office in the Capitol that does not have a member of the Israeli lobby as a part of the staff. At the same time, all this is going on, a major project of the Jewish intelligentsia during the 20th century was to marginalize Christianity by hiding behind the facade of civil liberties, which was a way to saturate young minds with pornography, disguised as entertainment, ruining decent family life. British intelligence and the Anglo-American Jewish bankers fomented the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, with the Jews running the Soviet Gulag and murdering millions of Christians before they came under attack themselves from Hitler. And even then, many of the Jews were employed in running Hitler's concentration camps. Plenty of documented information on that. And all this was in line with the basic philosophy of ruling the population by Marxist leveling of society while reserving the lucrative top echelons for themselves. And this strategy can be seen today in the installation of the woke liberal philosophy, for the increasingly impoverished masses while keeping control in the hands of the billionaire class. This strategy is well played out in the protocols, by the way. So the U.S. itself was becoming a Bolshevik state as it was supplying much of the firepower for the Allied victory in World War I and World War II, including the Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union and the genocidal bombing of Germany and Japan. But the Soviet Union, which had facilitated the funding of Israel and the founding of Israel, was now declared the enemy, starting the Cold War. So the U.S. has laid out its intentions for total global military dominance in studies and policy papers laid on the Franklin Roosevelt administration by the Council on Foreign Relations at the start of World War II, in creation of this, what we have now, the national security state in our country, step by step, incident by incident, including the CIA's involvement back in 1947, and then in the 1991 Wolfowitz Doctrine that I've talked about so much, authorizing preemptive war against any potential enemy not to the empire's liking, and the doctrine of full spectrum dominance on all military fronts, put forth by Bush II, Bush Jr., and the Obama administrations during the 21st century. Meanwhile, NATO would advance to Russia's borders, which is right where we are today, and all of this was codified in the Council on Foreign Relations doctrine enunciated by Richard Haas, who was the Jewish chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations for 20 years, that any nation must have imperial permission to exist. If they don't have the blessing of the Anglo-American alliance, if they don't have the blessing of the deep state, and the way they get their blessing is to surrender their natural resources to American industry. And by the time of the empire's proxy war in Ukraine against Russia that started back in 2014 with the Maidan coup, Haas's doctrine has attracted designation as the rules-based international order so beloved by his pronouncements of Biden's Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. Now, jumping back a little bit with Charles de Gaulle, one of the last real heroes of World War II, he had seen what was happening in the 50s and 60s and tried to head off the empire's ambitions by kicking the U.S. military out of France, as I said earlier, and promoting the idea of a confederation of sovereign European nations, he said, from Lisbon to the Urals. But he was deposed in a CIA-sponsored color revolution in 1968, and de Gaulle's opponents had already tried to assassinate him 30 times. And while being forced to stay in NATO, France today, as I said, doesn't have a single U.S. military base. And so what that has left Europe with is a European Union that de Gaulle helped to initiate, but now is run by just a gaggle of imperial lapdogs. Now, during the 80s and the 90s, the Straussians, known collectively as neocons, joined with the U.S. the military-industrial complex of Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, along with the Rockefeller-Rothschild-dominated big finance to take over the control of the U.S. government. And instrumental to all of this was David Rockefeller, who founded the Trilateral Commission to extend and rule over global finance. And the way had been cleared by their 1963 assassination of Kennedy. The Rockefellers' Dark Knight, who had tried to restore an indigenous U.S. currency and intended to pull out of Vietnam. And so this cabal also got rid of Richard Nixon, who he himself, in the footsteps of Kennedy, tried to reduce the power of the CIA and favored détente with the Soviet Union, which the Straussians can't have happen because they need war with the Soviet Union that goes all the way back to the earliest days of the English Empire. Then the 80s and 90s saw the banking elite behind Federal Reserve Chairman Volcker crash an otherwise very productive American economy. And at that point, you saw the shipping of just millions of American jobs to China and Mexico. You saw the deregulation of the banking industry, the predatory policies that created the leveraged buyouts and stock buybacks, the destruction of the extremely consumer-friendly savings and loan industry, the cancerous growth of derivative speculation. Then you saw the invasion of Iraq and the plunging of a newly looted Russia into depression after the 1991 fall of the Soviet Union, led by Boris Yeltsin. And then the US and NATO ransacked and destroyed Yugoslavia and got control of that oil. Then after Israel pulled off the 9/11 attacks, the United States, who is now in full obedience to Israel's ambitions and cheered on by Britain under Tony Blair and later Boris Johnson, has embarked, as we are currently involved in a series of wars in the Middle East, the Ukraine, and elsewhere, to complete what these people saw as the project of total world domination. And these wars are going on to this day with President-elect, well, he's not President-elect anymore, President Trump, seemingly no different than anybody else in bowing down to Israel. Now, the U.S., as you well know, has also sponsored Al-Qaeda. The U.S. has sponsored ISIS. The U.S. has sponsored other Islamist terrorists to regime change governments. And of course, we call this being independence-minded. Another type of terrorist attack was the COVID-19 gain-of-function pandemic, and the mRNA vax were meanwhile implemented by DARPA and NATO and Big Pharma for global population reduction and control. And one of the aim is to get rid of the pensioners and the other useless eaters. And so the final battle against China, now looming in front of us in order to complete the world takeover. And that is, in the minds of some historians and journalists, the reason for the calming down now and the ending of the Ukraine conflict, so that all of that energy and money can be directed towards the breaking up of China. But the U.S. wars have not been succeeding, with Russia returning to its Christian roots. In fact, one of the more startling statements of President Putin that he said about the Russian Orthodox Church was that God had put him in the position that he's in to be able to use the Russian Orthodox Church to save the soul of this planet. So the final battle against Russia, or China, is what's hanging over the heads of all of us. BRICS has now been founded in opposition to U.S. dollar hegemony. The American-European society fracturing into new anti-woke civil wars. And beneath the surface is this existential angst over the Zionist Israeli death cult, launching its own final solution against the Palestinians and other West Asian populations, because they already started the same thing in Syria now. In fact, the U.S., under the control of the Zionist neocons and the Israeli lobby, has made so many enemies abroad that the American homeland itself is now the target. And targeting becomes easier by the day with the empire's rapidly crumbling infrastructure. And the infrastructure is crumbling because the public sector is totally at the mercy of the predatory bond markets that I was mentioning, that's run by the billionaires and their usury-based hedge funds, layered with derivatives issued by the mega banks, completely on margin. And meanwhile, the American Military Institute has estimated that up to 50% of U.S. retail prices consist of compound interest charged by the banks for the use of the money. Up to 50%. Now, it should be obvious that the money is needed to fulfill an essential economic role obviously as part of our society needs for some means of exchange. But it was long ago privatized for the profits of the few. The American Monetary Institute has further estimated that all financial transactions carried out by the banks could be done at a cost of simple interest of 1%. Yeah, and still make money. And so, as I was first introduced to the LaRouche organization back in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, and I began to understand Glass-Steagall, and I began to understand how the reinstituting internal credit through a national banking system just made perfect sense, where the federal government would charter banks across this country that would only be loaning money for American productivity, American infrastructure, and American business. No gambling stuff, no derivatives, no margin stuff. And the federal government would loan the money to these banks at 1.5%. And then these banks would listen to you and me in our appeal to get a loan because we're going to build a hospital, or we're going to build another airport, or we're going to build a high-speed rail, or we're going to build agricultural canal projects, getting more water out of the high mountain snowmelt in the spring and summer. And the banks would loan the money that they had received from the federal government at 1.5%. They would loan it to us at 1.5%. Now, when the American Monetary Institute came out and said the federal government can do this and make money at 1%, why is it the way it is now? Why are interest rates on houses 6%? When according to the American Monetary Institute, it could be 1% and the banks still make tons of money. Now, it's not ordinary people trying to survive that has turned this beautiful garden of planet Earth into a war-torn, polluted hellhole. It's the empire. And now all these billionaire financiers and their military religious minions, it's not difficult to explain the financial travails of the world's national economies. I mean, talk about killing the goose that laid the golden egg, or the parasite that killed the host. That's exactly what has happened. I mean, maybe the billionaires could eventually blow up the whole world and escape to their bunkers before everything caves in, or the peasants can finally get across the moat with their pitchforks after their land masters. I'm sure Trump's army of Zionist advisors would know the answer. And there is an alternative which has appeared at times throughout history. It's called dirigiste, D-I-R-I-G-I-S-T. It's a French word. Dirigiste economics. It simply means that the central government works with the private sector to build up the physical infrastructure that benefits the entire society and provides a publicly guaranteed currency to fund development and provide a sound medium of exchange. This is what Glass-Steagall is all about. This is the Alexander Hamilton form of internal government credit, where loans would be extended by the federal government in Washington's day for only infrastructure, such as the Baltimore and Ohio Canal, or the Erie Canal, or the shipbuilding yards of Boston, or the locomotive, the steel Bessemer units of Pennsylvania. Now, before the Rothschilds and the usurers took over, Europe had this dirigista system, especially France during its grand period. The 19th century American system of the Whigs, later the Republicans, was a dirigista system. Napoleon and later Charles de Gaulle both tried but failed to renew France's dirigista economy. And so today you've got Russia, Iran, China building a dirigista system called BRICS, which is why they are defeating the West in the Ukraine and will do so on all other fronts. And in face of such sound economics, all the countries of the Anglo-American Zionist Empire, including especially the United States, Britain, Canada, Canada, Germany, Israel, they're all collapsing. And the U.S. could create such a system today, returning to Glass-Steagall and promoting the NEED Act, N-E-E-D, introduced in Congress by Dennis Kucinich back in 2011. It's currently on the books. You may never have heard of it, but it's critically important proposed legislation. You can blame your own government representatives for you not knowing about it because they cover it up. So, former Representative Ron Paul, who's been calling on the government to audit the Fed, and Representative Thomas Massie, who introduced legislation to abolish the Fed, while neither has proposed any solution as a replacement. That's where the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche organization comes in, because they do have, through NWAPA, North American Water Projects program, through OASIS in the Middle East, and the Midwest and the western states of the United States could use a little OASIS program too. In fact, that was proposed back in Roosevelt's day. Prior to Roosevelt, Roosevelt thought it was a good idea till he checked into Western politics, and it was not going to be supported by Western politics because they don't want people moving out here. The political leaders of the West, meaning the Intermountain West, only wanted a certain amount of people here because they wanted to be able to maintain complete political control over the real estate, over the money, over natural resources. And they did not want this Western development to take place. And this Western development would simply start with the mountains in northern Canada, the Rockies, along with Canadian compliance, because Canadians could then sell their water to the United States, and build a series of canals and dams and reservoirs from the higher Rockies in northern Canada all the way down to Imperial Valley, where the Colorado now drains a trickling of the moisture that falls from the sky in all of the Colorado River sources. So who's to blame here? Well, those who gutted this country for their own profit. And that's who it did. That's who did this. And it goes back to Elizabeth I in Walsingham. Her Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of the Economy, all rolled into one person, who was the power behind the throne. So when you think of history and you look at what's going on in Gaza with just this horrible, horrible genocide, while people stand back, while the Arab nations stand back, the Arab nations as a whole, and I think I can say this accurately, don't see the Palestinian cause as something they want to risk their money or their manpower to resolve. Because it gets in the way of business. And the business now that the Gazan population is in the way of is the oil and the gas reserves. And interestingly enough, when you saw what the Western alliances did with Iraq, what they did with Libya, what they did with the heroin trade in Afghanistan, what they did with the oil reserves of the Balkans, it all boils down to the same cabal that is in charge of everything else, that to some degree is centered there in the city of London, that 1 square mile Bank of England center that started reaching out over 300 years ago. And you look at what they've done to Italy, India, you look at what they've done to China, how these countries are starting to rebound and recover from that. And what are they doing? They're turning their back on the very money trust that busted them up, that got their people full of drugs, that stole their natural resources, that turned them into dope fiends in China. Run by a cabal of people who have no serious loyalties to speak of except to the quarterly report and the bottom line, who have done everything they can to destroy the youth of the Western nations, destroyed their music, destroyed their art, tried to destroy their sports, but apparently that's being recovered, in order to turn us all into a bunch of limp-wristed, on our knees, begging for our daily bread. Well, I am here to say that I, for one, have been fighting against this for 30 years on my radio program, and will continue to fight against this, and do whatever I can to awaken the sleepy eyes of my friends, my colleagues, as to how bad and how rotten things are. But at the same time, the greatest hope exists and is out there. And as the global South, the global majority, the BRICS nations are coming together, turning their back on the Western hegemonists, the hegemony-oriented monetarists who want to maintain the empire as it's been for several hundred years now, back to the early 1600s. To me, it's as simple as the nose on my face when I look at the history of all these things and how these things play into one another. The vast level of treason in my own country, let alone these other countries, where people like Lindsey Graham can go into the Senate with a net worth published through the election stuff of $850,000 and currently have reported a net worth of $42 million. These people are not your friends. And yet they continue to get reelected and reelected. So when you want to look at and consider the most excellent history of the world, of the United States, of all these other countries, you have to get into the money. I think you can bring that down to just the family unit. How successful the family unit is in coping with today's market forces and with children and education and everything, investment, is the flow of credit, the availability of credit, the ability to take $1 and turn it into $2, as opposed to taking $1 and then paying percentage on it for the rest of your life. You see it with student loans that are just way, way overpriced to get a college degree. And then, as I said, the American Monetary Institute said in their research that almost 50% of everything you spend money on is a result of all this credit play in the background. Some people call it taxes, and taxes are certainly a part of it. But a lot of it boils down to just these thieves, these miscreants, these enemies of mankind who got control of the world. And I think the world is finally starting to break free of that. All right, we're coming to the end here. K-Talk is going to go to national broadcast in a moment. I just want to remind you one more time of Jack's Packs, the May special for Mom. Hair, nails, and skin. If you, in lieu of Mother's Day, just in order to improve the health of mother's hair, skin, and nails, I've got Jack's Pack for that. It's at the office, 801-523-1890. I don't know if it's up on the website yet or not, but changes are coming to the website and changes are coming to the stream before too much longer. Equipment is being organized, set up to be able to produce a much more consistent, regular programming. And I appreciate your attention so far. Those of you on the stream, if you can like, subscribe, share, so we can increase the audience, might even be able to make some money off of this. So tomorrow will be a health program, plenty to talk about. The stuff that's coming out now, unbelievable, about the COVID vaccine and the dangers of only having had one injection. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and other things relative to improving our overall health profile. So I encourage you to continue to listen to K-Talk broadcasts. Keep watching. There we go. Now I am off K-Talk. I'll stop that, and I gotta see if I can record the show. It wouldn't let me save it yesterday. We'll see if we can get it to save today. Oh, brother. All right, I'm going to stop the stream. Thanks, guys. Thanks for being a part of this. You can email me, Jack Stockwell Office at Gmail, and if suggestions or anything else, or ways to improve the program, I would love to hear it. Thank you for being a part of the program, and I will